today's episode of People Matter. I'm joined by my colleague Remziye. Today we're going to be talking about long COVID. Remziye, I'm really interested to have a chat about long COVID because back in May, allegedly 2 million people were suffering from it, and therefore a lot of employers will have an employee who's suffering from long COVID. And I thought it would be useful to have a chat about, is it a disability, and top tips for employers in dealing with a situation where an employee has long COVID. So in terms of whether long COVID is a disability, we've got that typical answer of, well, it can be, it depends on all the circumstances. But before that, actually, why does it matter whether it's a disability or not?
Well, I think the key thing to be aware of is if an employee has a disability and an employer treats them less favourably as a result of that disability or something arising in consequence of that disability, or they fail to make reasonable adjustments, for instance, they may well find themselves subject to disability discrimination claims. Now, of course, that's important for many reasons. One of those might be a potential uncapped sum of compensation.
Exactly. And then in addition to that, there's other elements to an employment tribunal case. You've got management time being taken up dealing with it. You've got reputational damage, impact on employee relations, and so on. So this is all actually quite important for employers to be aware of.
Absolutely.
So in terms of employment tribunal cases, there was a recent case about whether someone's long COVID amounted to a disability.
Yes, so this involved Mr. Burke, who had COVID back in November 2020. He has brought claims of disability discrimination. He explained to the Employment Tribunal the symptoms that he'd been suffering with as a result of long COVID, and this included things like struggling with normal day-to-day activities, being exhausted after showering, not being able to take part in day-to-day activities like ironing, cleaning and shopping, for instance. In Mr. Burke's case, the Employment Tribunal found that he did have a disability as a result of his long COVID.
Exactly, and in making that decision, the tribunal looked at the different elements of the legal test for whether something is a disability.
Yes, exactly, and the legal test, in short, is whether someone has a mental or physical impairment, whether that impairment substantially adversely affects their ability to carry out day-to-day activities like the ones that we just talked about, and also if that impairment has lasted 12 months or is likely to last 12 months or more going forward. It is very fact-specific.
Exactly, yes. I mean, as you say, Mr. Burke, his long COVID was a disability, but that doesn't necessarily mean that long COVID will always be a disability, for every single person who suffers from it. It's a case of applying the different elements of that test, and in somebody's case, the impact of long COVID might not have more than a minor or trivial impact on their ability to carry out day-to-day activities, for example. It makes it a little difficult for employers to know whether the employee in question is disabled or not. So I think the best thing to do is to proceed with caution, and if you're not sure, then treat the employee as if they are disabled. So moving on then, and thinking about top tips for employers, what do you think are the best bits of advice to give an employer who has an employee with long COVID?
One thing to think about is whether reasonable adjustments might be necessary. So it might be that an employer has to look at flexible working conditions or a potential reduction in working hours. If someone has been absent, helping them with a phased return to work might be appropriate. But in general, being as supportive as possible and thinking about potentially consulting with occupational health as to what adjustments might be appropriate for that particular employee. It's not always so clear-cut.
No, exactly. And in terms of reasonable adjustments, whether it's reasonable to make a particular adjustment will depend, as ever, on a number of factors. For example, whether it's practical to implement it, whether it's likely to overcome the specific disadvantage, and so on. And I suppose picking up on the point around offering support to employees who are off sick, that there's an element around, do managers need additional training in terms of dealing sensitively with employees who are off sick, thinking about medical information, storing that with appropriate confidentiality in mind, and also thinking about policies such as absence management policies, reviewing and updating those as appropriate. I think also there's this question of, someone who's had COVID and then has a few short-term absences for seemingly unrelated reasons. that might be a case where someone actually is suffering from long COVID, and that's another case where the medical advice you referred to could be really helpful. I think ACAS has published some guidance about long COVID, hasn't it?
Yes, exactly. So last year, ACAS published some guidance about how employers can deal with situations with long COVID. And in essence, it reminds employers of how to approach absence management processes, for instance. As with any long-term condition, they remind employers to take all steps possible before actually embarking on an absence management procedure, like the steps that we talked about. So supporting an employee with possible adjustments to their working conditions and assisting them with possibly a phased return to work. There's also a reminder to seek expert medical advice where necessary. And actually, ACAS reminds employers that there may well be an overlap with other protected characteristics and other types of discrimination claims that they might need to be aware of. Evidence has shown that long COVID may well affect older employees, ethnic minorities and women potentially more severely. So I think employers need to be alive to the fact that there may be other discrimination claims at play as well.
Exactly, and thinking about the question of claims and the question of dismissal, if an employee with long COVID is dismissed, which is doable, if they have more than 2 years service, they can bring an ordinary unfair dismissal claim in addition to a disability discrimination claim. So I think an employer who's considering dismissing an employee with long COVID, there are certain steps that it's sensible to take. So warning the employee that they might be dismissed, consulting with the employee about their current state of health, their likely prognosis, also looking at if a return to their existing role isn't viable or isn't really working out, is there suitable alternative employment for them? And then going back again to the point we've discussed a few times around medical information, getting advice from a medical expert, ideally occupational health, and taking that into account before making a final decision. And then if a decision is likely to be taken that the employee will be dismissed, considering actually, is there anything else available in the form of income protection or ill health retirement?
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you very much for joining us on today's episode of People Matter. We look forward to seeing you next time.